On September 8th, 2024, the heart of Paris looked like it had been ripped from the pages of a fairy tale. The air was bright, crisp, and golden as the sun slipped across the Seine and into the narrow cobblestone streets of the Latin Quarter. Inside a centuries-old Gothic chapel, the soft glow of candles flickered against ancient stone walls draped with lilies and roses. Guests murmured in awe, their voices hushed as the bride appeared at the arched doorway. Anita Patel, just 26 years old, stood radiant in a cream-colored sari that shimmered under the stained glass light. Her dark hair, braided with tiny white blossoms, fell over one shoulder as she walked carefully down the aisle. Her eyes sparkled with a mix of nerves and wonder. To everyone in that room, she was the image of elegance, a young woman who had traveled halfway across the world to start a new life in Paris and had somehow found love. Waiting at the altar was Julien Moreau, 34, a lawyer from one of the city's most established families. He looked every bit the part of the storybook groom. Tall, well-groomed, his navy suit tailored perfectly to his lean frame. His family filled the first rows. His mother, Chloe, an art historian, sat upright and proud, while his father, Antoine, leaned on his cane, smiling faintly but watching everything with sharp eyes. Behind them, the whispers rippled. What a beautiful couple! So exotic, so perfect. Phrases that floated like incense through the air. The priest spoke of love without borders, of two cultures meeting as one. When Julien took Anita's hands, his eyes were wet. "You've changed my life," he said softly, his words catching in his throat. "You showed me love has no boundaries." Anita's reply trembled, but it carried across the chapel. "With you, I finally feel a home." Guests leaned closer, snapping photos, tears slipping down cheeks as though they were witnessing something rare and pure. For a moment, the world outside, the politics, the noise, the judgments didn't exist. There was only this union, sealed beneath vaulted ceilings and ancient stone. The reception moved to a rooftop restaurant overlooking the rooftops of Montmartre. The Eiffel Tower glowed faintly in the distance, and music floated through the evening air. The menu was a careful blend: cocoa vin with saffron rice, creme brulee with cardamom. Glasses of Bordeaux clinked as speeches flowed. Julien's colleagues toasted his perfect match. Friends praised Anita's brilliance, her charm, her ability to fit seamlessly into Parisian society. Anita laughed politely, her sari shimmering under strings of fairy lights, though at times her gaze wandered toward the horizon. Her closest friend, Claire Martin, noticed. Claire, a fellow developer from Anita's company, leaned across the table. "You look nervous," she whispered. Anita's smile was quick, practiced. "Just excited," she said. "It's a new chapter." Claire didn't press, but she knew what most didn't, that Anita carried layers of history she rarely spoke about. For now, Claire let it go. Tonight was supposed to be about happiness. Later that night, in the opulent suite of the Hotel Muris, Julien uncorked champagne as Anita stepped onto the balcony. Below her, Paris twinkled like a constellation, the streets alive with laughter and traffic. Julien kissed her hand, raising his glass. "To us. To our future." Anita clinked her glass against his, her lips forming a smile. Yet, as she looked out over the glowing city, the weight of an unspoken truth pressed against her chest. She wanted desperately to believe that this future was hers, that this love was enough. But deep down, she felt a chill the autumn air couldn't explain. What the guests had witnessed that day was, on the surface, perfect. A fairy tale of East meeting West, of destiny written in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower. But inside Anita's heart, shadows lingered. Secrets, no matter how carefully buried, have a way of clawing themselves into the light. And while the world toasted their happiness, she couldn't silence the quiet voice that whispered from deep within. This love was balanced on fragile glass, and sooner or later, something was bound to shatter. Anita lay awake in the hotel suite long after Julien had fallen asleep, his steady breathing filling the dimly lit room. She stared at the ornate ceiling, her fingers nervously brushing over the silk sheets. From the outside, her life looked flawless. She had married into a respected Parisian family, celebrated under cathedral arches, toasted under fairy lights, and now slept in a 5-star hotel overlooking the Tuileries. But inside her chest, a storm churned. Secrets never rest, and hers was one she had carried across continents, across oceans, buried deep beneath layers of charm, intelligence, and careful smiles. Back in Mumbai, her childhood name had been Raj Sharma. She rarely let herself think about it anymore. The syllables tasted foreign now, like a language she had forgotten, growing up in a conservative household. Anita had learned early that certain truths about herself had to remain unspoken. She remembered the long monsoon nights, staring out the rain through the narrow windows of her family home, praying that one day she could escape the body and the name that never belonged to her, to her parents. She was a son destined for engineering school, marriage to a respectable woman, and a life that mirrored theirs. But Anita's dreams had always stretched far beyond the confines of their small apartment and rigid traditions. Her teenage years were filled with quiet rebellion, sneaking into internet cafes to read forums about gender identity, writing diary entries she had to burn before her mother could find them, and secretly trying on clothes that made her feel like herself for the first time. The turning point came in her early 20s, when she saved enough money to begin hormone therapy. It was a lonely process, filled with whispered appointments and constant fear of being exposed. Each dose of estradiol was both liberation and risk. But as her reflection slowly shifted into the woman she had always seen inside, Anita knew there was no going back. France had been her escape hatch. A tech startup in Paris had offered her a position, and with it came a work visa and the possibility of reinvention. In Paris, she was Anita Patel, software developer, independent, ambitious, exotic in a way that Parisians found captivating. With official documents that reflected her true gender, she felt safe enough to live without. Constantly looking over her shoulder, she built a life brick by brick. A small apartment in Belleville, long hours at work, friendships with colleagues who admired her intelligence. And then, unexpectedly, she met Julian. Julian had been charming from the start, swooping into her life with the confidence of someone who had always belonged. He had shown her the hidden gardens of the city, invited her into his circle of friends, and spoken to her as though she were the most fascinating person in every room. When he proposed at sunset on the Pont Alexander III, she cried, not just from joy but from fear. She loved him, but she also knew the weight of the secret she was keeping. She convinced herself that it didn't matter. She was Anita in every way that counted. Raj had been buried years ago. Yet, as she lay in a hotel suite on her wedding night, she couldn't shake the thought that her marriage was built on fragile glass. She had sidestepped intimacy, blaming exhaustion from the wedding. Julian had accepted it with a smile, but she saw the flicker of impatience in his eyes. How long could she keep improvising excuses before the truth clawed its way into the open? The days that followed were filled with small signs of unease. Julian's affection was real, but so was his possessiveness. He liked to know where she was, who she spoke to, and how long she would be gone. At first it seemed like love, like care, but when she caught him glancing through her purse one evening, she felt a cold wave of dread. She had hidden her hormone medication as best she could, but the bottles felt like time bombs waiting to explode. She tried to reassure herself. France recognized her as Anita, a woman in every legal sense. Julian loved her, didn't he? Maybe he never needed to know about the journey it had taken to get here. But as she looked at her reflection in the mirror of their Montmartre apartment, adjusting her blouse, she whispered to herself, I am Anita. Rajesh is gone. Still, her eyes betrayed her fear, because deep down she knew secrets don't stay buried forever. And when the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't just threaten her marriage. It could destroy her life. 3 weeks after the wedding, Paris had already shifted from golden autumn to a damp, gray chill. Anita had tried to build a routine in their Montmartre apartment. Cooking dinners, attending work meetings, smiling when Julian introduced her as my brilliant wife. On the surface, nothing had changed. But underneath, every day felt like walking across a thin sheet of ice. She hid her medication at the bottom of her toiletry bag, tucked receipts into the lining of her purse, and avoided questions about her doctor. Every time Julian leaned in to kiss her, every time he touched her waist, her heart pounded with fear. She knew the clock was ticking. The discovery happened on an ordinary Tuesday. Julian had come home early, his polished leather shoes echoing across the parquet floor. Anita was in the bathroom, hurriedly sliding pill bottles back into her bag after refilling her weekly pill box. She froze when she heard the door creak. Julian's reflection appeared in the mirror behind her. "What's that?" he asked casually, setting his briefcase down. "Just vitamins," Anita said too quickly, zipping the bag with trembling hands. Julian stepped closer. His sharp lawyer's instincts picked up every flicker in her voice, every bead of sweat forming on her forehead. Without waiting for permission, he snatched the bag from her hands. "Julian, don't." The zipper gave way with a violent tug. Out spilled small glass bottles with half-scratched labels. He picked one up, squinting. "Estradiol? What is this?" Anita's throat went dry. She stammered. "It's for irregularities. My cycle." Julian's brow furrowed. "Cycle? You've never even been to a gynecologist since we married. I would know." He pulled out his phone, typing furiously. His eyes scanned the screen, then froze. Slowly, he read aloud, "Dr. Helene Russo, endocrinologist, specialist in hormone therapy and gender reassignment." The room seemed to shrink. Anita felt her knees weaken. "Julian, please let me explain." His face drained of color, then flushed crimson. He dropped the bottle like it was poison. "Gender reassignment?" His voice rose, trembling between disbelief and fury. "What the hell is this? Who are you?" "I'm Anita," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I've always been Anita." "You're not a woman," Julian roared, the sound reverberating through the apartment walls. "You lied to me. You tricked me into marrying a man." The neighbors could hear, but no one intervened. Anita shook her head desperately. "I am a woman. I was born in the wrong body, but I fixed it. I am your wife." Julian staggered back, pacing the room like a caged animal. His voice cracked as he shouted, "My career, my family, my name, you've destroyed all of it. Do you know what people will say when they find out?" Anita reached for him, but he shoved her hand away. "Lucas," she started, forgetting herself, then corrected. "Julian, I love you. Nothing about that was ever fake." But he wasn't listening. His hand shook as he tore open her drawers, dumping clothes onto the floor, searching. "Where are your real papers? Your birth certificate? What was your name?" "Stop," Anita pleaded, tears streaking her face. "That name doesn't exist anymore. It never existed." Julian yanked open her laptop, scrolling through her email. His eyes lit up with cruel triumph. "Raj Sharma," he read aloud, his voice dripping with venom. "There it is. Raj. You're Raj, a man from Mumbai pretending to be my wife." Anita's heart shattered. "That was never me," she said firmly through her sobs. "I buried that name. I am Anita. I am your wife." But Julian's expression twisted into disgust. He slammed the laptop shut, his breathing ragged. "You disgust me," he spat. "You made me sleep with a man. You turned me into the very thing I hate most." The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. He stared at her like she was a stranger, his perfect bride suddenly reduced to what he believed was a cruel joke. Finally, with a deadly calm, he said, "Get out, right now, out of my apartment, out of my life." Anita's legs wouldn't move. She clutched her bag, broken bottles rattling inside, as Julian dragged her toward the door. "This place belongs to my family," he hissed. "You don't live here anymore. Take your lies and go." The door slammed, the lock clicked, and Anita stood alone in the cold hallway, rain lashing against the windows. Through the wood, she heard his muffled voice on the phone. "Mama, sit down. I have to tell you something. It's about Anita." Anita slid down the wall, sobbing, clutching shattered bottles and the remains of her carefully built life. Paris had promised her freedom, but in that moment, the city felt like a cage. The truth was out, and nothing would ever be the same again. Julian didn't sleep that night. While Anita sat outside in the rain, clutching her broken bottles of medication, he paced the Montmartre apartment like a man possessed. By dawn, his mind was made up. To him, this wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation. And humiliation, in his world, demanded revenge. The first call he made was to his father, Antoine Moreau, once a high-ranking civil servant in the Ministry of Finance, still had connections everywhere. Julian spoke in a cold, detached tone, as though he were briefing a client. She lied to me, Papa. She married me under false pretenses. I want everything about her checked. Her papers, her work permit, her past in India, everything. Antoine didn't ask questions. He simply said, I'll see what I can do. Within hours, Julian was at his law firm, spinning the story to his closest colleagues. He didn't mention the word, transgender. Instead, he painted Anita as a fraud, a schemer who had trapped him in marriage with fake documents and a fabricated life story. Over glasses of Bordeaux in a chic bistro that evening, he leaned forward, his voice dripping with self-pity. She's not who she said she was. None of it was real. I have reason to believe she's wanted in India for fraud. Imagine that, me, a respected lawyer married to a criminal. The men around the table shook their heads, muttering words like deception and scandal, exactly the reaction Julian wanted. Meanwhile, Anita found herself in free fall. She returned to work, trying to bury her shame in routine, but on Monday morning her manager, Hervé Blanc, called her into his office. He couldn't meet her eyes. Anita, I'm so sorry. We have to terminate your contract. Her voice cracked. Why? My performance has always been excellent. Hervé fiddled with his pen. There are concerns about your papers. Legal risks. We can't afford it. Anita stared at him, realization sinking in. This is Julian, isn't it? His silence told her everything. By noon, she was unemployed, her email account disabled, her access card confiscated. That evening, she dragged her suitcase to the cramped apartment of Claire Martin, the only friend she could turn to. Claire's short blonde hair was damp from the rain as she opened the door, her expression tight with concern. Anita collapsed into her arms, sobbing. He's going to destroy me. Claire guided her inside, made her tea, and whispered, Then we fight back. He doesn't get to erase you. But Julian's campaign was just beginning. Using his legal contacts, he filed for an annulment, citing fraud and emotional distress. He demanded damages, framing himself as a victim of a calculated deception. At the same time, he leaked whispers into the press. Within a week, tabloids splashed headlines across kiosks. Paris lawyer duped by exotic bride, trans fraud scandal in the elite circles. The nuance of Anita's identity was lost. The story was packaged as a juicy betrayal, a spectacle for public consumption. Julian stalked Anita's social media, screenshotting old photos, twisting them into narratives that suited his version of events. He sent anonymous tips to gossip blogs, claiming Anita had faked her qualifications, faked her family history, even her university degree. To him, this wasn't just about ending the marriage. It was about obliterating her entirely. At night, Anita lay awake on Claire's couch, scrolling through hateful comments online. Strangers called her a liar, a fraud, a monster. She turned off her phone, but the damage was already done. She whispered into the darkness, He's winning, her voice breaking. Claire, from the next room, called back, Not if I have anything to say about it. The harassment grew bolder. Anita noticed a sleek black BMW parked near Claire's street, engine idling. She knew the silhouette behind the wheel. One night, as she hurried inside with groceries, Julian's voice rang out across the street. Rajesh, you can hide behind a new name, but you'll never hide from me. Neighbors peeked from their windows, watching the confrontation as if it were theater. Anita's cheeks burned with shame. The following Sunday, Claire convinced Anita to attend a support group for LGBTQ plus survivors of abuse. Anita sat in the circle, her sari replaced by a plain sweater, her eyes rimmed red. When it was her turn to speak, her voice trembled. I thought I had escaped. I thought Paris was freedom. But he's turning the city into a prison. Around her, heads nodded. She wasn't alone, though it felt that way. Back in Montmartre, Julian raised his glass of whiskey to his reflection in the darkened window. His once polished appearance was beginning to unravel, tie loosened, hair unkempt. but his voice carried the smug certainty a man convinced of his righteousness. "She made me a fool," he muttered. "And fools don't forgive. They destroy." By the end of November, Anita's world had been stripped bare. No job, no home. Her reputation shredded, her safety uncertain. All that remained was Claire's unwavering loyalty, and the terrifying knowledge that Julian's thirst for revenge was far from satisfied. He wasn't finished. He was only just beginning. The night of November 23rd was the kind of night Paris seemed to hold its breath. Rain slid down the cobblestones in glistening sheets, the street lamps glowing like blurred halos in the mist. Anita sat in a corner cafe in Saint-Germain, her hands wrapped tightly around a porcelain cup she hadn't touched. She stared at her phone, the last message still glowing on the screen. "Meet me tomorrow at 7 p.m. at Café d'Or. We need to talk once and for all." It had no name, but she didn't need one. The clipped tone, the demand. It could only be Julian. Claire had begged her not to go. "It's a trap, Anita. He doesn't want closure. He wants control." But Anita was exhausted. Exhausted from the whispers, the stares, the feeling of living like prey. "Maybe if I just hear him out, maybe if I face him, he'll stop," she told herself, though even she didn't believe it. And so, against her better judgment, she stepped out into the wet Paris night. When she entered the cafe, Julian was already there, hunched in the far corner. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. His once polished hair was greasy, falling into his face. His cheeks were hollow, his tailored suits replaced by a rumpled coat, but his eyes, sunk in wild burning, made her chest tighten with fear. "You came," he said without looking up, his voice hoarse. "I came to end this," Anita whispered, sliding into the chair opposite him. "What do you want, Julian?" He raised his head slowly, and the hatred in his expression chilled her to the bone. "I want you to cease to exist." Her breath caught, but before she could respond, he stood abruptly, reaching across the table to grab her wrist. "We're going for a walk." "Let go," she hissed, trying to pull back. The cold press of metal against her ribs silenced her. She froze. He had a knife. The other guests, lost in their own conversations, didn't notice as Julian forced her from the cafe and into the rain-soaked streets. They walked in silence, the wet pavement gleaming under the street lamps, until he steered her toward the Seine. The embankment was nearly deserted, the rain having driven away even the lovers who usually lingered by the water. Julian pushed her against a stone parapet, his coat clinging to his frame, his breath sharp with whiskey. "Why are you doing this?" Anita's voice shook. "I never wanted to hurt you. I'm the same person you fell in love with." "No!" He snapped, his facade shattering. His voice echoed off the river. "You're a liar, a cheat, a man in a dress who made me a laughingstock. Do you know what it means for me? For my name? My colleagues whisper, my family pities me. You've ruined everything." He slapped her, the blow so hard her head whipped sideways, the sting searing across her cheek. "You made me sleep with a man," he spat, striking her again with his fist. Anita collapsed to the ground, blood mixing with rainwater on the stones. Julian loomed above her, shaking with rage. "You'll pay for what you did." He dragged her up by her hair, his hand trembling as he pressed the knife against her throat. The blade was cold, the edge biting into her skin. Anita's breath came in short, panicked gasps. "Please," she whispered, the rain plastering her hair to her face. "I still love you." Those words didn't soften him. They ignited him. "Love," he roared. "You don't even know what that means." His eyes glistened with madness. "You're going to die tonight, and no one will miss you." The knife pressed harder. Anita shut her eyes, preparing for the inevitable. And then footsteps. Rapid, steady, splashing through puddles. A faint beam of light bobbed closer, a jogger, her headlamp swaying. Julian froze. The jogger slowed, sensing the tension. "Tout va bien," she called out. Julian's jaw clenched. His eyes darted from Anita to the approaching figure. He leaned close, his lips at Anita's ear. "This isn't over. It will never be over." And just like that, he shoved her down, released her, and vanished into the darkness, his footsteps swallowed by the rain. Anita lay crumpled on the wet stones, clutching her bleeding face, her ribs screaming in pain. The jogger dropped to her knees, pulling off her headlamp. She was a nurse named Marie, her voice urgent as she called emergency services. "Stay with me. You're safe now. Just hold on." Blue lights soon painted the riverbank, sirens cutting through night. Paramedics lifted Anita onto a stretcher, her eyes swollen, her body battered but alive. As the ambulance door slammed shut, she whispered to herself through the haze of shock, "He's not done. He'll come back." And somewhere in the shadows of Paris, Julian Moreau, lawyer, son, once proud groom, was already planning his next move, his obsession deeper than ever. At dawn the next morning, the Seine looked deceptively calm, its surface reflecting the pale gray of a cold November sky. But beneath that calm, Paris buzzed with a single name, Julian Moreau. Hours earlier, police had received a frantic call from a jogger who had discovered a young woman bleeding along the riverbank. The victim was identified as Anita Patel, newly married only weeks before. Her attacker? None other than her husband, a respected commercial lawyer from a well-connected Parisian family. Commissaire Jean-Luc Dubois, the same officer who weeks earlier had questioned Anita's residency permit, now found himself leading the manhunt for her abuser. The irony was not lost on him. He shuffled through crime scene photographs, blood droplets on wet stones, Anita's sari torn, a knife mark across her throat just centimeters from ending her life. A lawyer from a prestigious firm, son of Antoine Moreau, he muttered to his partner. "This won't be simple. Every step we take, someone will try to block us." In the hospital, Anita lay bandaged, her cheeks swollen, ribs taped. Claire Martin sat at her bedside, her fingers wrapped tightly around Anita's hand. Doctors told her she was lucky, 1 inch deeper, and the blade would have severed her carotid artery. Anita's voice was hoarse when she gave her statement. "He told me I was going to die. He said it would never be over." Meanwhile, Julian's family mobilized. Antoine called in favors from old contacts in the Ministry of the Interior. Chloe, his mother, went on record in the press. "My son has been a victim of a cruel deception," she told reporters gathered outside their elegant apartment. "He married under false pretenses. He is a man under extreme emotional stress." Their strategy was clear. Flip the narrative. Paint Julian as a betrayed husband, not a violent predator. The French media devoured the story, but not in the way Anita had hoped. Instead of sympathy for a survivor of domestic violence, headlines screamed trans fraud rocks Paris elite and when love turns to lies. Tabloids plastered Anita's photo alongside cruel before and after speculations dug from old online archives. On talk shows, pundits debated not Julian's brutality, but whether Anita should disclose her past. In the cafes and metros of Paris, the story became gossip, a scandal, a curiosity. For Anita, it was hell. Released from the hospital after a week, she returned to Claire's small Belleville apartment. They turned it into a fortress. New locks, a second-hand security camera, blackout curtains. "I feel like I'm in prison," Anita whispered one night as she peered through the slats of the blinds. Claire squeezed her shoulder. "Better in prison than in a grave." Police promised extra patrols, but resources were stretched thin. "We can't assign a unit to guard you 24/7, Dubois explained during a visit. "We'll do checks, but you need to stay vigilant." Anita nodded numbly, but the weight of it crushed her. Everywhere she went, she felt eyes on her. Every black car idling at the curb looked like his BMW. Every shadow stretched too long. Meanwhile, protesters gathered outside the Palais de Justice. LGBTQ plus rights groups held candles, chanting "Justice for Anita." They carried signs that read being trans is not a crime and stop excusing violence. But their voices were drowned by louder ones. Conservative commentators framed Julian as a tragic figure driven to madness. Hashtags trended on French Twitter. Hashtag transfraude. Hashtag poor Julian. Public opinion fractured down the middle. Inside his law firm, Julian's absence was felt but not condemned. Colleagues avoided comment, some muttering privately that the situation was complicated. Rumors swirled that he had already fled Paris, perhaps to Belgium or Switzerland. But detectives weren't convinced. Dubois studied Julian's file late into the night. Men like him don't run to disappear, he said grimly. They run to regroup. He's still here, and he's still obsessed. For Anita, the scars ran deep in the bruises. She woke gasping at night, hearing his voice in her dreams. This will never be over. Each morning she forced herself to sit at Claire's kitchen table, sip bitter coffee, and apply for jobs she knew she'd never get. Her reputation had been shredded by Julian's whispers. Potential employers Googled her name and turned away. Yet, in the silence of Claire's living room, surrounded by padlocks and cameras, Anita found flickers of resilience. She told Claire one night, "I survived the Seine. He didn't win there. Maybe he won't win anywhere." But neither of them could ignore the truth. Julian was still out there, and Paris, divided and distracted, had already chosen sides. December draped Paris in a thin veil of frost. Christmas lights blinked along the boulevards. Shop windows glittered with displays, and families hurried to the streets clutching shopping bags. For most, it was a season of joy. For Anita, it was survival. Each trip outside with Claire felt like stepping into a war zone. Eyes scanning every corner, ears straining for the sound of footsteps that didn't belong. Still, she couldn't stay locked away forever. One gray afternoon, she convinced herself to venture out. She and Claire bundled in coats and scarves, heading to a Belleville supermarket for groceries. The store was crowded, warm air smelling of bread and coffee. A brief escape from the cold. Anita let herself breathe for the first time in weeks. She and Claire laughed quietly over the choice between baguettes or naan, a fleeting moment of normalcy. Bags filled, they pushed through the sliding doors and into the chill evening air. That's when it happened. Rajesh. The voice cut through the noise of the street, like a blade. Anita froze. Claire stiffened beside her. Slowly they turned. Julian stood a few yards away. At first glance, he was unrecognizable. Gaunt cheeks, wild eyes sunk into dark hollows, hair matted under a baseball cap. His once perfect posture sagged beneath a heavy coat, but the hatred radiating from him was unmistakable. Anita's heart slammed against her ribs. "Leave us alone, Julian," she said, her voice trembling but firm. He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Leave you alone? After what you did to me. You destroyed my life, my family, my name. And you think you can just stroll around Paris like nothing happened." People on the street slowed, sensing tension but keeping their distance. A few phones lifted, recording from afar, the way Parisians often turned real-life danger into spectacle. Julian's hand dipped into his coat. When it emerged, it clutched the same knife he had pressed to Anita's throat weeks earlier by the Seine. The blade glinted under a street lamp. Claire instinctively stepped in front of Anita. "You'll have to go through me first," she said, her voice sharp, unwavering. Julian sneered. "So be it." He lunged. Claire dodged, his blade slicing fabric instead of flesh. Screams rang out as bystanders scattered, though some still filmed with shaky hands. Anita shrieked, grabbing at Julian's arm. The three of them crashed to the icy pavement, the knife flashing dangerously close. In the chaos, a young man sprinted forward. Ahmed, a local delivery driver, had been locking his scooter nearby. Without hesitation, he seized Julian from behind, pinning his arms. "Run!" he shouted at Anita. But she didn't run. She threw herself into the struggle, clawing for the knife. The weapon clattered to the ground, spinning across the wet sidewalk. Ahmed held Julian in a chokehold. Claire kicked the knife out of reach, and for a moment it seemed over. But Julian thrashed with the strength of desperation. His face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "You'll never be free of me," he spat at Anita, his voice ragged. "No matter where you go, I'll find you. This isn't over." Sirens wailed in the distance, closing in fast. Blue lights reflected on the damp street. Panic flashed in Julian's eyes. He knew what came next: arrest, trial, humiliation. In that instant, his rage turned inward. "If I can't have you," he hissed, his tone suddenly calm, terrifyingly calm, "then no one can." Before Ahmed or Claire could react, Julian broke one arm free, reaching toward the shattered pieces of Claire's phone that had fallen during the fight. He snatched a shard of glass, jagged and sharp, and pressed it to his throat. "Julian, no." Anita screamed, lunging forward. But it was too late. With one brutal swipe, he slashed across his neck. Blood gushed onto the snow-dusted sidewalk as he collapsed, his eyes still locked on Anita, wide with hate even as life drained from them. The street erupted in chaos. Shrieks, sirens, rushing officers. Ahmed staggered back, horrified, his hands slick with someone else's blood. Claire pulled Anita into her arms, shielding her from the gruesome sight. The police shoved through the crowd, weapons drawn, only to find a dying man and a traumatized woman sobbing into her friend's shoulder. Julian lay motionless, his chest rising once, then falling for the last time. The knife lay forgotten. The cameras of strangers captured everything. His collapse, Anita's screams, Claire's desperate embrace. By morning, the footage would flood social media, dissected by pundits, spun into headlines. But in that frozen moment on a quiet Belleville street, there were no sides, no debates. There was only Anita, trembling in Claire's arms, realizing that the man she had once loved had chosen death over ever letting her live free. Relief and horror mingled in her tears. It was over, but it would never truly be over. The morning after the bloodshed in Belleville, Paris awoke to a city buzzing with headlines. Julian Moreau's death on the icy pavement was everywhere. Front-page spreads, endless news cycles, live debates on TV. But instead of being framed as a violent man who had stalked and nearly killed his wife, the story became a spectacle of betrayal and tragedy. Prominent lawyer driven to madness by wife's secret, one newspaper declared. Another plastered Anita's face beside Julian's. The caption reading, "Love or fraud?" For Anita, the days that followed felt surreal. Police took her statement, officers nodding solemnly as she described the attack. Commissaire Du Bois admitted quietly, "You were right all along." He was obsessed. Yet the system that had doubted her still seemed reluctant to call her what she truly was, a victim. The official line emphasized Julian's mental stress, while her ordeal was reduced to a footnote. At the hospital, Anita sat by a window overlooking gray rooftops, stitches pulling at the corner of her mouth, her ribs aching. Claire was never far, her hand always near Anita's, grounding her. "You survived," Claire whispered one night as Anita flinched from another nightmare. "That's what matters. You're still here." Anita nodded, but her eyes filled with tears. Survival didn't feel like victory. It felt like a haunting. Meanwhile, the world outside chose sides. LGBTQ+ groups rallied in the streets, candles flickering under banners reading justice for Anita and stop excusing violence. Survivors of domestic abuse reached out, their voices weaving into hers. But across social media, cruel hashtags trended. Strangers debated her existence as if it were a courtroom case. She tricked him, some wrote. What else did he expect? Others countered. No one deserves violence for living their truth. The divide cut deep, and Anita became the unwilling symbol of a cultural war. The annulment of her marriage was finalized posthumously, Julian's family pushing for statements that framed him as a tragic casualty. Antoine Moreau stood before cameras, his face heavy with rehearsed grief. "My son was misled, deceived. He made mistakes, but he was a good man." Anita watched the clip from Claire's couch, bile rising in her throat. A good man? A good man didn't press a knife to his wife's throat or stalk her through the streets of Paris. With Julian gone, there would be no trial, no verdict, no prison sentence. Justice, in the traditional sense, would never come. But Anita refused to let his shadow define the rest of her life. With help from advocacy groups, she secured new residency papers under protective statutes. A diversity-focused tech startup offered her a position, this time not in spite of who she was, but because they valued her courage and her voice. On her first day back at work, she sat at her new desk, fingers trembling over the keyboard, and let out a long breath. She was beginning again. Claire remained by her side, their friendship deepening into something more. They cooked together in the evenings, filled their small apartment with laughter, and found moments of peace among the scars. One quiet night, Anita turned to her and said, "Maybe this is what real love feels like, not grand gestures, not fairy tale weddings, but someone who stays when the world falls apart." Claire smiled softly. Then maybe this is where your story really begins. Still, the ghost lingered. Anita woke from dreams drenched in sweat. Julian's hateful eyes burned into her memory, his final words echoing, "This isn't over." She carried those scars, both visible and invisible, into every new day. But when she stood before a small crowd at an LGBTQ plus awareness event months later, her voice steady into microphone, she gave those scars meaning. "I am still here," she told them. "I am still Anita. Survival is not weakness. It is resistance. And sometimes, survival itself is the greatest form of justice." The audience erupted in applause. For the first time since her wedding day, Anita allowed herself to believe that the chapter she was writing now was hers alone. Not the fairy tale others expected, not the scandal others dissected, but a life she had fought for, one breath, one wound, one act of defiance at a time.